Is it, am I recording?
Okay, so advocating for marriage and family in hostile environments. The irony of that is
they're going to be
that,
sitting.
the fruit that's produced of good marriages and families is quite delicious, and I guess you could also say in research we would call this the outcomes, and yet our society and our world is hostile towards those outcomes. It's like we want to eat the garbage, we don't want the good fruit that comes from it. So that's the irony that we're kind of navigating. And I think it's pretty understandable considering the background of many of these individuals, but I'll leave it at that. What questions do you want to ask from the get-go? Does anybody have any? Yes, sir. And what's your name?
My name is Roger.
Roger. Okay.
Yes. I'm just curious, what do you think, why do you think the society or campuses are hostile towards marriage and family values and having a good relationship?
Make sure nobody turns.
Why is the academy like campuses,
Yeah, why is there a
academia?
hostile environment,
Okay.
generally?
Because I believe in chivalry, I'm going to let her go first. Actually, I have some thoughts on it. Okay. Why? That's pretty complex. There's a lot of movements in history. I think when you take the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s, and then, and this is going to sound strange, but the individualistic self-esteem movement where we're trying to help people by artificially inflating their self-esteem. I think there's a lot of movements leading up to this. A lot of laws that were passed. Our culture has been shaped more and more, Western culture is more and more individualistic than it ever has been before. So that's, I think, where we got on our culture today. Now, campus cultures, in a way, we've gone from, I'll just maybe boil it down to more individual person. We have a basic need to want to be seen as competent or smart or kind or fill in the blank. Not everybody has that, but I think most people have that, whether or not they admit it or not. Political correctness at its core is I want to be seen as fill in the blank. And so I'm going to speak the politically correct language so I can be seen as open-minded or kind or tolerant or whatever descriptor you want to put in there. When that becomes in our God, little g God, then we're always going to be bowing to that particular feeling or desire to want to fit in, to want to be seen that certain way. So if how other perceives us is more important than truth, then, and we've never even questioned that dichotomy or maybe that contradiction, then, and everybody else is doing it, then I think that's perpetuating this. So on college campuses, some things that are fueling it, and I don't know if this is the core of the why, but some things that are fueling it. There's a video that I don't know if I have it on my laptop. These professors created fake research articles. They wrote it and just wrote basically to identity politics, and they made up stuff, and they were very eloquent in what they wrote. There was 4 or 5 of them that got together. Have you seen this? Well, so they did this, and they published it in some of these journals that are supposed to be peer-reviewed. Peer-reviewed means that there's other academics looking at it. And they got published, and they got a lot of praise. And again, this was fake research. So if you know what the cadence is that you're supposed to march to, and you know what the talking points are supposed to be, then you're more likely to be able to get tenure because you're publishing in certain types of journals. So I think that's just a dangerous environment where we're kind of incentivizing that everybody thinks and acts this way. And marriage and family are viewed as oppressive. Feminist movement has done some great things, but now it's become radicalized, and that's also contributed to this focus on the individual. And family and marriage are viewed as, there's an old Seinfeld episode, I've never heard of Seinfeld, the TV show, old Seinfeld episode where Jerry Seinfeld is wondering if he and George Costanza, because they're single in their 30s or 40s, and by choice, because they're incredibly paid, and they're wondering if maybe they should have children and be married. And Kramer comes in and just squashes that idea. He says, "What are you thinking about, Jerry? Marriage? Family? They're prisons. Man-made prisons. You're doing time. You get up in the morning, she's there. You go to sleep at night, she's there. It's like you have to ask permission to use the bathroom. So why do I use the bathroom now?" He's like, "I'm not good." So I'm just basically doing the whole episode for you right now. But that's a strong belief, and I think it's ironic that on campus, and tragically ironic that on campus cultures that those things are perpetuated when all the research shows that married men earn more money, have more sex, have higher life satisfaction, etc. Doesn't mean every marriage is happy. But we don't even talk about those things. So we should be able to talk about those things. I think it's a compassionate thing to lead people to truth so they can find greater happiness rather than just the individualistic culture. And I had one more thought on that, and I promise my answers won't always be this long. Are you timing me? Okay. And I can't remember what it was, but maybe if Lynn offers her thought, it'll come back to me. So that was several different factors, cultural fitting into it. Again, it doesn't totally make sense to me why it's doing that, but I do know there's this strong desire to want to be seen a certain way. And it doesn't make sense. Academy or academia is supposed to be the bastion of open, free thinking, where we should dialogue all the different perspectives and where we try to understand this really well. And we teach students how to think, not how to repeat back what we say. So when my students ask me challenging questions, like, well, what about this situation? What about this situation? I'll say, well, what is the premise you're coming from? I want them to challenge their premises and their assumptions, and I want them to learn how to think rather than just bark back at me what I want them for a test. That's what academia should be doing, is helping them learn how to think, not learn how to recite a script. So.
Thank you. A couple thoughts. One is the failure of churches to grow, to answer fundamental questions about life and God and purpose. And so we have decided that we don't need church. And with that, we don't need absolute values. And of course, that gets into the individualism where everything is determined by just my feelings, etc. So, I mean, I think we have a responsibility to try to really answer important questions about transcendence. I mean, it's natural in humans to ask these questions, but we sort of label them as stupid, which is really, really unfortunate because I think we're spiritual beings. We need to ask these questions. So once we get rid of absolute values, things kind of disintegrate. You know, I mean, marriage is difficult, and people are hurt in marriages, and people are emotionally hurt. So, I mean, I think a lot of feminists, I think a lot of gay people, there's a really maltreatment there, so that they're resentful and they're not understood, so they want to rebel against the institution of marriage, institution of religion. Also, what sells? You know, capitalism is great, but unless you have some core values, you're more concerned about what you can sell than what it does to people. So we're really susceptible to produce things that have terrible messages and makes money, so we justify that. So, and on the campus, you know, we got all these grown-up hippies on campus, and they got touched by free sex and found it nice. Yeah, like the professors. You know, birth control, once you divorce sex from procreation. Obviously, there's some good things about birth control, but that's a huge thing to separate sex from procreation. It's a huge thing. Yeah, so we need to improve marriage. You know, I believe we're gonna make it better than ever we can, but we sort of let these things not being taken care of.
Needed some way to cope, so I got high almost every day. Parenthetically, most of the worst stoners I knew are now working in finance or politics. In fact, this is what made me first realize that I was a fan of limited government. I do not trust these goofs to make policy. Their power must be constrained. This brings me to another black hole in the college experience: useless majors, the only thing more pervasive than marijuana and irresponsible future leaders. I'm not being judgmental here. I have a degree in film and media studies and political science. Why did I choose them? They're subjects I like talking about. Practical, right? But I wasn't alone. Most of my peers also chose to spend their student loan money on subjects better learned on YouTube or Turner Classic Movies. By the time graduation approached, none of us had developed any actual job skills. And people want to raise taxes to pay for free college for everyone? Are you kidding me? No, just no. I'd only give a free education to a smart kid who promised to get a degree in whatever the exact opposite of my degree is. And that degree didn't come cheap. I took on tens of thousands of dollars of debt, but never spent a minute learning how to manage it. No such classes were even offered. I might have actually learned something useful if they had been. I didn't learn about taxes either, other than that the rich should pay their fair share. It was only after college, when I was lucky enough to get my first job, that I discovered the truth. The government takes away a lot of your money. Frankly, it's shocking. And that's not even counting the mandatory $400 a month deduction for my student loans. I'll probably have that albatross around my neck for the rest of my life. Really, I can't believe my peers and I spent so much time shaming conservatives for wanting to lower taxes. A past version of myself would call this desire to keep what I earn selfish. The current, cheerfully realistic version of me knows this: I can spend my money much better than the politically correct stoners who are running the government can. So I guess, in a roundabout way, I did get something of value out of my expensive liberal arts education after all. Common sense.
Okay, the point of that video, by the way, was not to see whether you agree with her political views on government spending and all that, but to demonstrate the environment maybe on college campuses that is perhaps perhaps is a very nice word, one-sided. So whether or not you agree with her conclusions on government spending and what you think about the government, I think that's beside the point. It's more about the environment. The mono-thinking was the word that sticks out to me. So that's just an illustration. So let's get some other questions. Maybe that has prompted some more thoughts. Yeah.
I've experienced with close friends, people telling me that they don't want to get married because they don't need their relationship validated by an institution or by a piece of paper. What would you say to that?
That they don't want their relationship validated by a piece of paper. That's not necessary.
Yeah, they don't need it validated by an institution.
I always like to, when I get into these kind of conversations, I always like to put the question back on them and say, well, explain. Tell me why you feel that way. What's the rationale? And if everybody did that, would that be a good thing? And have you ever asked them that question? Yeah, to me, that's the discussions. Those are the kind of things that need to happen of say, well, tell me why. What's the principle behind that? And how is that going to be? And is this just morally relativistic, which is dangerous? Is this a principle that can apply to other people that would benefit other people too? Or is this just because of you? And see, I like to really unpack a person's premise, not because I think they're wrong or right, but because they probably haven't. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what would you say to that? And I'll give you some more thoughts on it.
I think the point is, do they want to validate it? You know, I mean, do we really care that much about what other people think about what we're doing, or is this important? Is this relationship important enough that I am willing to validate it, even though I think whatever? I mean, put your commitment out there publicly so that your community can support you because you think it's valid. So mean, if you don't think your relationship is so valid, I would question what's going on in your relationship. This is not about how other people see me. It's, you know, am I committing to my husband before God? I probably have some more thoughts.
Just to follow up on that. So there's more than two, but I think two major ways of thinking about marriage and relationships. Professor Robbie George at Princeton and others like Ryan Anderson have broken it down, called it the consent-based view of marriage and the comprehensive or conjugal view of marriage. And people are coming from usually one or two of those veins, of those beliefs about what marriage is. And my guess would be, and I'd want to ask them, because I don't want to just be presumptuous and say, well, I know what you're thinking. But if we don't even see what their premise is, then we're going to be, again, hacking at branches. We're going to be speaking almost two different languages. The purpose of marriage, and then I have asked perhaps the question, why, so a piece of paper, that's a governmental thing. The government got involved at some point in marriage. You have to look at the history of why that is and what's the societal view or societal benefit of marriage. Did the government get involved just to regulate adults' love lives and just to affirm it and say, you're married, boom. Now you can have self-esteem about your relationship, or you can have relationship esteem. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And if we go down that, and to me that's the consent-based view of marriage. And consent-based view of marriage basically says two or more people, it's about the degree of love and emotion and romance, and it lasts as long as the love lasts, as long as that emotion, it can be two or more, and it doesn't really matter. This comes out of, again, the sexual revolution, cohabitation, non-marital childbearing, pornography. They all feed into this mindset of consent-based. It's basically about two or more adults' love, and it lasts as long as the love lasts. The comprehensive view is more of marriage is a unit of a man and a woman based on exclusivity, permanence, and monogamy, and gender complementarity. And if the government got involved for the consent-based reasons, if that's the reason why they got involved, then I could totally understand it. I would say, that makes sense to me. I don't need the government to validate it. If that's what the purpose why the government gives those pieces of paper, then maybe not. And with what Lynn said, if your spouse or your fiance wants that, and you really love him or her, then what's the problem in doing that? So there's, I think, a lot to unpack there and say, tell me what you think marriage is, and tell me why you think the government's involved in the first place. Do you think it's just about regulating your love life and making you feel good about being married? Because if you look historically, it's because the family's the most humane, the most economical, and the most powerful system known for building competence and character in a citizen who's going to become a productive worker and citizen, and therefore not break the laws because their parents who created them have reared them to be a contributing person in society. They wanted to incentivize that, so because when that breaks down, social, political, and economic systems break down too. So, but we've kind of evolved on that purpose. At least that's my view of it. But I would be open to listening to that person. Do you see what I mean? Not because I want to show how open-minded I am, but because I think they honestly believe what they believe, and I want to learn from them, and they're not going to learn anything from me if I'm not willing to learn from them. Does that make sense?
I just would like, Tim. Oh, yeah. It's good to ask them questions where they're coming from. I'd be curious, so when in your relationship would you be willing to break it up? You know, how far are you willing to take this relationship? Because I'd really like to know what is the resistance to personal commitment to do my utmost for you, my darling. Because I need to think about that. It's substantial. If you're willing to say publicly, I'm making this vow. And also, I know there's statistics about belief in marriage impacts your investment in marriage. If you don't actually think it's that valuable, you don't understand the purpose of it, you don't understand actually it's for the sake of children, primarily, but for the sake of society, then they don't value it so much. And couples that understand the value of marriage will invest much more, because it's not just me. I mean, it helps to be religious also. Studies show that too, because again, we're committing ourselves to something higher than just me and just you.
Sorry, I put my hand out too quick, but I cut you short when I cut off your okay. Let me give you a perfect illustration of consent-based view of marriage. It's a beautiful night, we're looking for something dumb to do. Hey baby, I think I want to marry you. That's consent-based view of marriage. Doesn't matter if it's two men, a man and a woman. And if we wake up and we say we want to break up, that's okay, yeah. I don't remember how he sings it, but Bruno Mars, okay? That Hollywood and music has perpetuated the consent-based view of marriage. It's basically about, let's do this, we're feeling this strong emotion, and maybe we'll ride it for 10 years, maybe for 10 days. And maybe we'll be exclusive and monogamous, and maybe we won't. It just depends, it's up to us. So, and again, I can respect the person who has that view, even though I don't think that view is healthy for society or for children, according to research. So, does that help?
Yeah.
I mentioned the question thing. I'm going to put this up here really fast. I've shared this before. I shared a version of this in my breakout session. So this is from the Arbinger Institute, a book called The Anatomy of Peace. And this is what they call the influence pyramid. So I think this is something that needs to be, if you're in a hostile environment or against whatever you believe about religion, marriage, family, fill in the blank, whatever it is. This is how you influence others without being manipulative, without being controlling. I talked about listen and learning. I guess the basics here, there's three most lessons. Most time and effort should be spent at the lower levels of the pyramid. Get out of my box simply means, how am I justifying my heart at war towards that other person? How am I justifying seeing them as an object rather than as a person? Because when we get these hostile environments, we can get so much flack that it's easy to just now vilify and demonize the other person and be like, well, they don't deserve my answer. Or I'm not even going to ask them questions. Why would I ask what they think? I already know what they think. They're yelling it at me. They're picketing it right in front of me, right? And they're throwing a bunch of mud at the same time. But if I see people as people who have needs, hopes, desires, fears, and dreams that are as valid to me as my own, they're no longer obstructions to my ability to be happy. They now become people. A quick story that has helped me with this. I have a good friend who he's a big dog fan. He's a dog owner. And he has it, they call it a brag dog. It means a dog that does all these tricks and will do pretty much anything you train it to do, and you can brag about it to your friends. So he took this dog, who was a hunting dog, out into this field where he would just show off to all of his friends all the commands his dog would do. And he was talking them up for days. They finally got there, and the dog wouldn't do anything. He just gingerly would walk over and grab something and bring it back, and he was just getting frustrated. This dog was misbehaving for the very first time, and he was embarrassed. It's like, I talked this dog up. And then after 30 minutes of this, his friends are mocking him and saying, you're bragging this dog up. And he's pathetic. He doesn't behave at all. So they're getting back into their vehicles, and he puts his dog forcefully back into the cage. And then he says, you just embarrassed me, stupid dog. He gets back to his house, and he checks for birds and things that might be in his fur, like he normally does. And then he put his hand from the chin of the dog down his throat, down the chest. There was like a 4-inch gash, and it was wide, it was straight to the bone, just bleeding profusely. And he doesn't know how it happened or when it happened, and I'll just cut to the chase. I mean, he shares a lot of lessons from this, but basically the dog was not misbehaving because it was a bad dog. The dog was misbehaving because it was wounded, and it could not fulfill the measure of its creation because of that deep wound. I believe that a lot of people who are hostile on campuses to marriage and family have deep wounds, and they are quote unquote misbehaving. And if we don't see them as people, this bottom level, it doesn't matter how much we share with them. It doesn't mean, the world will say, if you love me, you will believe and accept everything about me. That's not what love is. If my son came up to me and said, hey Dad, I've discovered that sugar all the time, all 3 meals, no matter what, and that's what makes me happy. I'll be, oh, that's what makes you happy, good. Diabetes makes you happy, that's great. You know, that's what it's going to lead to. So true love would help me to want to do something, to influence him to see that there's a better way to live. He does eat sugar, but he wants to eat every meal, but he doesn't. So I guess what I'm trying to share is this influence pyramid is down here. If we can't see other people as people who may or may not be wounded, and let's face it, many of us are wounded, then it won't really matter. What we try to do is spend all of our time on correction. So the first lesson is, most of the time should be spent at the lower levels. The second lesson is the solution to a problem. If you're having a disagreement with somebody in a hostile environment, and you're just communicating, teach and communicate, you're just teaching back and forth. Well, this is what I think about marriage, this is what I think about, and back and forth. Then perhaps you need to spend more time listening and learning and trying to understand their perspective. This is more of the micro one-on-one rather than just what we would do macro and social media. And I think even in classrooms you can ask questions. I've been in many hostile environments where I'll ask a question where I'm thinking they're misdiagnosing the problem. And I'll raise my hand and I'll just say, I understand what you're trying to say, but can you help? This is something I'm thinking about. This is the paradigm I'm coming from. Could you help me understand the answer to this question? Have you thought about it this way? And many times they have never even heard of that, sort of. And if they have, you just keep pushing in a loving way to get that perspective out there. And if the professor isn't changed, I guarantee you there's going to be people who are in there that are silent. They're going, oh, I've never heard that before. And perhaps you can actually have a real discussion. I'll go into this, I could go into this more, but I'd say read the book because it's amazing. So it's called The Anatomy of Peace by The Anatomy of Peace. Yeah. And since CARP's all about peace, I think it dovetails quite well. It's by the Arbinger Institute. And I get $5 for every book. I'm kidding, I don't get it.
Great book, I
Yeah.
realize, so you're not gonna get my $5.
Oh, okay. So, yeah.
It just really echoes what you're saying. I think we have a certain burden on us to have a parental heart. In any relationship, we have to listen to the other side, listen to the hurt and the pain, and really try to understand. And the parental heart, like the example you're saying, we have to listen and understand, but also take responsibility to guide and ask questions. This permissiveness, you're accepted no matter what, this is so all over the place. We've just lost the understanding of parent-child relationship. I mean, that's what God is to us, right? So, but the burden is really on us to try to understand the hurt of another person, not accept it, not just because we want to be nice, to admonish maybe, but with a compassionate heart. And it's very difficult when you're being attacked. You're a hateful. Your response is to defend yourself, right, and attack back, and you can't do that.
I tried, it doesn't work.
Try with my husband, it doesn't work. So, the burden is us to try to understand and explain how we see things. And it really is this parental heart is what we need.
So this isn't a fancy way of just saying whatever, but just love everybody, and of course you need to do that, but this isn't. Therefore, we never share any of our beliefs, or it can be misconstrued that way.
What have you found that people who don't agree or hostile want that's common with what you want in building healthy families and marriages?
Yeah. Can I put that in the context of like radical feminists at the United Nations? Because they want, it's clear what they want, because they've put it on everywhere. I mean, they yell it, tattooed it on their arm. But, they want it. And in fact, I don't know how you start there. Is it okay? Let me re-ask the question and have you, because you're at the UN more often than I am. So ask it one more time, because I want to make sure we're capturing the essence of what you're saying.
So here's you with your values.
Uh-huh.
We're talking about these spiritual values.
Uh-huh.
Here's your opposition, and they're upset, right? And they're stating, opposition at you. What have you found they want in their heart of hearts that we want?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
In the heart of, like,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I just think in terms of teaching class, in terms of confronting the sexualized values, I always go to, in terms of students challenging, they want love. That's why I put it in my presentation. We all want love, genuine love, and I think you have to kind of dig into what that means, because I think it means just accept me, like garbage without, again, unparentally, but that's not genuine love. You have to love and help someone. Wish I had more sleep. Anyway, so yeah, I try to, like when I show a video to my class, and it's about a man and woman talking about love and talking about even sex. And this guy talks about sex in the most amazing way, about it's life-giving, and God is present, and they don't hear this on campus. And I get such a result like, that's what I want. So yeah, you have to talk about the ideal as a real possibility. Just quite separate direction. We had a program with, not we, but there was a program at the UN with Heritage Foundation where radical feminists were on the panel, because we were talking about how this transgender situation is erasing what a woman is, and therefore the whole woman's rights issue doesn't exist anymore. If there's no such thing as a woman, what are we fighting for? So we're getting more feminists that are sort of saying, oh, yeah, there is gender differences. So that's interesting.
So some of the themes that have been talked about today in many of the presentations was that we all want to feel loved and connected and bond. So every human wants to feel validated. Every human wants to be cared about, to know that they're important to someone, and to feel that love, that sort of unconditional love. So I would say at the core, that's what everybody wants, no matter what their views are. They're just going about it a different way. And I always tell that to my students, because I always bring students to the UN, and I'll say, look, when you run into people who seem to be loud and perhaps the opposite, and they maybe seemingly hate you from the beginning, just remember they want the same things you want. They just are diagnosing the problem differently, and therefore their prescription is going to be different. And any of us who've ever been to the doctor and have had the wrong diagnosis and then taken the wrong medication, I had a stomach problem for years, and the target kept getting moved, and nothing was working. Then I finally got a celiac disease diagnosis, and so I stopped eating gluten. Voila, I'm free. And I kind of see it this way: all these people, man and woman, radical or not, because they view me as radical. I look like a radical nut job to them. I know, because I've been called that. And my kids would probably agree that I'm a nut job. But anyhow, but they all want the same thing. They all want to know, do I matter to somebody? And therefore, if they're raised in a very different, maybe perhaps they're wounded. The research even has found that, I brought up radical feminists, a couple studies out of the UK have found that women who grew up I talked about father-daughter relationships, who had horrible relationships with men, particularly their father, they're more likely to overuse men or mistrust them and then try to come up with these ideas. So when I look through their lens, I can see why that would make sense to them. It doesn't mean it's true. doesn't mean it's good. But at the core, that's what everybody wants. And so we have to find a way to figure out how are they trying to seek out love, connection, and belonging. Belongingness is what we all want. And they may just go at it very strange to us, but we're strange to them. And we have to be willing to acknowledge that, and again, talk about, I think, at these core values at the base level, and then work our way up from there. We have time for maybe one more question.
Sometimes you're having a discussion in the background, you hear somebody screaming and you're like, "Arr!" And you know whose side they are on, because that's how they work. I mean, it's sad, but if they're trying to dominate the whole audience, and the audience came to hear the experts. I mean, I was actually imagining this might happen to me. It didn't. I'm so disappointed. In terms of being, you need to demand respect of them too. Just because they're angry, it's like when I get angry, I'm empowered. Well, that's not true. When I'm getting angry, I'm actually abusing power by volume, whatever. So that's not how humans learn from each other and relate. So time is up. So anyway, we need to remind them that I respect your differences, but please respect mine and my thinking and my ability.
So you really have to know where they're at. You have to know how open. And if they, this is not a conversation they want to have, then you have to gauge that. We're out of time, but I want to see what your question is just really quick, because I saw your hand up.
So my question is, in society, in the world now, homosexuality is becoming more and more common and more accepted. So would you say that it's realistic to even talk about nuclear families, or would you say that's realistic thing to do, or not really?
Well, it depends on what you mean by realistic. I think it has to be talked about. If we really want to have a pluralistic society where we want to have these ideas, if we stop talking about it, then there's only mono thinking. But you can still do that in a respectful way. And I think if you study these issues in depth, then you start to feel empowered. You start to feel empowered to be able to talk about these things and reason with each other. And I've got friends on all sides of these issues, and we can still get along. I've had students on all sides of these issues. This last semester, when he was challenging on everything, loved it because we learned a lot from each other. But it helps me be more compassionate. And she came up to me after the semester and she says, I've never heard a reasoned argument, if you want to call it an argument, position on marriage between a man and a woman, other than somebody thumping the Bible, which is not a bad thing, but you have to know your audience. If they're not open to that, then I wouldn't go there. But there's philosophical and evidence-based reasons, and you can do it in a compassionate way, and we can still get along, and we can still disagree. I think one of the best examples of this is Dave Rubin. I don't know if you've heard of the Rubin Report. It's a YouTube channel. He's a gay married man, atheist, pro-choice, and yet he brings on some of the most conservative guests, and they talk open, and they get along, they're laughing together, and it's just such great dialogue and thinking. I walk away from that. He's very much for whatever is practical for society, and what does the research say, and what are the philosophical flaws in this argument. He's a great thinker, and he's open to just that dialogue, and I think he's a pretty good model for that sort of free speech and free thinking and still getting along. So if you stop, then it becomes one side and only one side, because there's a movable middle there that are silent.
Just be aware, there's really bad research out there that you hear over and over and over. Gay parents are just as good as, if you kind of suspect it doesn't make sense, suspect it and do some research, because a lot of people use this bad research that's based on just self-reporting, et cetera, that is used. So beware.